the construction of a new base using all means, by all means. So this is the no to Henoko new base demonstration. But Japanese government sent hundreds of police forces every day to Henoko to stop these demonstrators. Mr. Hiroji Yamashiro, one of the head of the peace activist, was arrested and imprisoned. So he was invited to United Nations to speak about this Okinawa base program. United States made a government while governing the Luchu Islands. This is a civil administration of the Luchu Islands building. And the High Commissioner was the governor, the ruler of the island. Third High Commissioner, Lieutenant General Paul Callaway, said, reversion of Okinawa is a myth. In other words, not reversion, self-government or autonomy of Ryukyu is a myth. So in other words, United States and Japan will not give autonomy or self-government or self-determination. Military base generated problems are rampant. The rape and the murder of 6-year-old Yumiko Chan by a U.S. soldier in Kadena on September 30, 1955. An Okinawan elementary school girl was crushed to death by the fallen trailer in Yomitan village in June 12 and 1956. On March 7, 1996, the 3 American soldiers abducted and raped 12-year-old Okinawan schoolgirl walking home after buying a notebook. F-100 jet fighter crashed on the Miyamori Elementary School, killing many school boys and girls. And this is a helicopter suspending, flying over the Yomitan village even now. So this is a trailer fell upon the this schoolgirl, and helicopter crash took place on Cox International School University, Cox University, in 2004. Rape and murder again took place by ex-USGI in April. U.S. military ex-Marine Franklin raped, murdered, and abandoned 20-year-old office worker, Miss Rina Shimabukuro, in Uruma City, in Okinawa, while she was taking a walk. And land, soil contamination by toxic chemicals, water contamination, water pollution come from Futema Air Base. So also noise damage. Military planes flying over the houses, schools, hospitals. Professor Matsui of Hokkaido University found 10 persons around the Kadena Air Base are dying from noise damage every year. Of course, other people are suffering from noise damage. The Department of Culture and Environment Affairs, Okinawa Prefecture Government, March 1999, summarized the side effects of aircraft noise pollution around the Kadena Military Air Base as follows: psychosomatic health disorders such as sleep disorders, preschool children's abnormal behaviors, effects on long-term memory, a higher rate of low birth weight infants, hearing losses, and so on. Demilitarization of the Ryukyus and the Pacific. The military-based generated problems have been destroying democracy, peace, and well-being. Military bases aim at war that destroys and kills indiscriminately. War is not a means of solving international conflicts. We humans should learn to calm down, to discuss peacefully and constructively so as to compromise our mutual benefits. Now is the time to discuss demilitarization, demilitarizing our precious world. In spite of this opposition of the Okinawan people, Okinawa has been heavily militarized by United States and Japanese defense forces from southern tip of island, Yonaguni Island, Ishigaki, Miyako, Okinawa, Amami, Oshima, and Mage Island of Kagoshima. So Okinawa, Ryukyu Island has become the target of so-called American Japanese enemy nations. Summary. In 1879, Japan hijacked the Ryukyu Kingdom and stolen its independence in the rights to practice self-determination, like in Hawaii. Number two, in 1945, the US military forces confiscated vast spaces of land, sea, and air that have been severely suppressing the people's right, freedom, and democracy in Okinawa for past 74 years. Ryukyuan people have 100% right to become free, from both Japan and the United States control, and to restore independence. 2013, the Association of Comprehensive Studies for Independence of the Ryukyuan peoples was established to achieve Ryukyuan independence again. Four, the power to self-determination is exercised by the leaders and for the leaders of the government. This is autocracy, not democracy, because of democratic government is based on Abraham Lincoln's idea, as he emphasized, the government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. Since time is, can I go on or stop here? Okay, let me finish. Number five, Ryukyuan people have 100% right. I'm sorry. Number six, when the rulers habitually practice their unfair and abnormal behaviors to the suppressed, they soon become to feel themselves as if it were fair and normal. The suppressed must raise their voice outward for justice and for the restoration of normalization of human rights. So, my dear precious friends, please help us, this suppressed Ryukyuans and Hawaiians and Marianas, to become free and independent from the outside control. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Nakamura.
You're welcome.
Let's see. Just going to stop the share screen here. Okay. All right. Thank you, Professor Nakamura. Next, we turn to Madam Muñeca de Oro, an Indigenous Chamorro mother, peace activist, educator, and community organizer based in the Mariana Islands. She is a Just Transition Curriculum and Policy Fellow with Climate Justice Alliance, coordinating community-based solutions with member organization Micronesia Climate Change Alliance. She is deeply involved in efforts uplifting the experiences of Pacific Islanders on the front lines of the climate crisis. Madame de Oro received a BA in Anthropology in 2011 and a Micronesian Studies Graduate Program Certificate in 2019, both from the University of Guam. She has wide professional and volunteer experiences in social justice, historic preservation, environmental protection, and cultural perpetuation. Madame de Oro is on the board of directors for the Guam Environmental Protection Agency, was selected by the U.S. State Department as a Young Pacific Leader in 2019, and is an alumnus of the Sierras Club Women Earth Alliance 2020 Accelerator Program. Madam De Oro, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Hafide Tiro, I'm so grateful and honored to be a part of this panel to present the question on why and the urgency of why we need to demilitarize the Pacific immediately, given the tensions in the world right now and the volatility of oil and gas. I'm actually like at a gas station right now, kind of like cringing at the cost of fuel. And in listening to the dear professor's remarks and his long history of resistance in Okinawa, I can't help but feel compelled to bring up the resistance of my ancestors too. Like the Okinawans and Hawaiians too, we are all island communities who have been and seen and felt and then continuously to today the wrath of colonization and it continuously experience the inability to exert our sovereignty and our human rights to protect our water, to protect our lands and our airs and all of our natural resources in which and all of our communities too are very much the sort of colonial engagements that have happened in all of our lands and in our islands that we all share is that connection to the military being the largest sorts of extraction and contamination and degradation of our islands. And in the Marianas, just to give a little bit more of a update for the sort of actions that have been happening by the U.S. military in the most recent weeks, there's been a rampant display of posturing to the region, namely China and Russia and North Korea, from our islands. In the end of January, and the beginning of February, the Marianas hosted Operation Cape North, in which 6 other nations and over 15,000 Navy, Army, Marines came and practiced exercises throughout our airspace, our water space, not just in the Marianas, but throughout Micronesia as well. And on the ground, that looks like so many planes flying low in our beaches throughout all hours of the day. It was troops spilling up our airports. It was people. It was lots of military people having R&R on our beaches, and it was just an increased level of activity, which was in one case celebrated by the local business community because it was an infusion of tourist dollars, which we haven't seen because of the pandemic. But in another case, it was definitely a strain on our environmental resources. And at the same time that we share our islands for training of war and the posturing of the United States' power in the region, we are struggling as a community in our homelands to survive. We have really high rates of homelessness, really unhealthy communities because of colonization and introduced diets and reliance on imported foods in our islands and real high cases of non-communicable diseases. And all of these are inextricably linked to colonization and the inability for us to practice our cultures with our lands. I'm currently on the island of Guam, but I also live in the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas. And on Guam, the Department of Defense owns a third of the island. And I really want to pay much respects to those freedom fighters in Okinawa who for decades have been militant and diligent in the protection of their lands and in the shutting down and have been successful in shutting down military operations and that sort of fortitude. And I see the dear professor and I really get a lot of hope from him and seeing how long and how active he must have been in his resistance and his protection for his islands and his peoples. and we very much are in it for the long haul in our islands as well. We have a military base, a marine military base that was just activated last year, and that's going to be hosting Marines that from bases that were shut down in Okinawa, and with that construction of the base included 900 football fields worth of limestone forest degraded and graded down to the ground to make way for the cantonment or the base, as well as the firing range complexes that will be activated in the next few years. And these areas where the military constructed these installations are pristine environmental and cultural resources. There's many disturbed ancestral burials that were found and then disturbed and then destroyed, and other ancestral resources and important cultural resources. And there was and they were also in pristine habitats, and some critically endangered species are only found in the areas that were destroyed for these military installations. One of them being the Ceranthes nelsoni, there's only one mature tree left on the island of Guam, and it's within 300 feet, or what the biologists deemed allowable for this final species on our island to coexist with training grounds for weapons. And also with those fire range complex, it's built right on top of the aquifer, the single source aquifer from like 90% of the island, and the prospect of lead contamination and other heavy metal contamination, because 16 million bullets are going to be rounds of bullets are going to be shot over on those complexes. The likelihood is very high that there'll be water contamination in the lifetime of these ranges. And as we see, contamination of water is something that the military likes to evade responsibility for, as we've seen in Red Hill in Hawaii. And it really takes true acts of courage by the community to stand up to hold the military accountable. And also, I want to uplift the efforts of Protect Guam Water, as well as Protahila Tex and Save Retidian, in some of their efforts to protect our lands and waters. One of them being a lawsuit that was just filed at the end of January with Earth Justice, and that is to stop the open pit burning of unexploited ordinances right on the beaches of Taragi on Anderson Air Force Base, which is an ancestral site, which is a land on top of lands that were never returned to families, and families are still awaiting their ancestral right to their lands. And there wasn't enough real information as to what the impacts of these open burn pits will be on our islands. But it's incredibly destructive and very very disturbing to the natural environment and also the spiritual environment, because those are ancestral grounds. Things like lati stones, which are the pillars of our community's homes over 1,000 years ago, up until the time of colonization, are still standing in those areas where and in the surrounding areas of where they want to have those open detonation burn pits. And there's still so much happening within the Marianas. On February 23rd, they broke ground on the island of Tinian for a divert airfield, just in case there's an attack on Anderson Air Force Base or other inclement weather in which they need to quickly move airplanes, B-52s and bombers and whatnot off of Guam. They're going to be quickly moved to the island of Tinian, which is about 80 miles north of Guam. With that too, there was 2 hangars, which are both hundreds of millions of dollars paid by the U.S. taxpayers, that was just opened on Guam within the last 2 weeks. So projects for the military buildup of both Guam and the Northern Marianas have been in full swing. Hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars are being poured into military infrastructure. And given the political climate, it doesn't increase security for us on the ground. It actually increases the size of the target to have this much more resources and weaponry stationed on our islands. And we've seen and experienced direct threats from North Korea and from China before. And there's been propaganda about bombs named the Guam Killer that just really makes it hard to feel safe and secure in our islands, and islands that we've called home for thousands of years. And lastly, just last week, one of my favorite islands, the island of Rota, which is just 40 miles north of Guam, that I have ancestral roots in. It's one of the most peaceful islands, and it really escaped a lot of the militarization post World War II, and it escaped a lot of the bloodshed from World War II. So it just feels vibrationally different to have escaped war so much. They just activated a THAAD, or a long-range missile defense system, on that island. And it's only an island of 3,000 people. There has never been any real long-term military infrastructure on that island before. And it's just going to completely change the feeling. Even though it's just one mobile THAAD, it just makes the impending war feel all the more real in our region. And along with the Marianas, there's also a lot of posturing throughout the rest of Micronesia, in Palau and in the Federated States of Micronesia, to also be bolstering the presence of the U.S. military in our lands and in our waters. And none of this is to the benefit to the people in our region, and none of this, especially in the case of Guam, is done with free, prior, or informed consent. And if there's anything that we see and have experienced with the presence of military, it is lasting contamination, and it is the loss of life, either by slow death with toxicity, or with straight up war and violence. So we really need to, especially with the compounding threat of climate change on our islands, we really need to find a more peaceful, more mutually benefit way to share the earth. We really need to be looking more into renewable energy and more progressive ways of being in relationship with one another. Even though conflict is unavoidable with human relationships, there is a way that we can do it that doesn't result in nuclear catastrophe and doesn't result in loss of life and suffering beyond measure. And I really hope that the world recognizes the need to have women and especially Indigenous women lead us through the crisis that we're going through, and put those who are on the front lines, especially with the climate crisis, at the forefront of innovating and finding solutions to go through this climate crisis. And lastly too, I hope all of our communities here, from Hawaii to Okinawa, can come together to call on world leaders, especially at the Conference of Parties and the UN negotiations on climate change, to have militaries not be exempt from climate protocols. It's ridiculous that the United States military is the single largest consumer of fossil fuels and the single largest polluter in the world, yet they are completely exempt from the Kyoto protocols and the Paris Agreement. They don't have to report their emissions, nor do they have to do anything to draw back on their emissions. And that's a big oversight if we're really wanting to tackle the climate crisis. It's a major oversight on behalf of the peoples who suffer from hosting military bases, and on behalf of those who are most vulnerable to climate change, which include us out here in the Pacific. Thank you so much. I look forward to listening in to everybody else's remarks, and I'm so grateful again, Robert, for your invitation to speak and to give remarks coming from the Mariana Islands. Suzus Ma'asi.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you so much for educating us about the situation in the the Mariana Islands. We received some comments. We received a comment from Joyce Kaupuiki, saying what these people are going through, the same thing that we're going through, military taking more land for more housing to be used by military families. It's a huge problem. Joyce says, I feel for these people. We are all going through the same thing. Hope they will win. Thank you for your comment, Joyce. With that, we would like to turn to the Hawaiian Islands. Our next speaker is H.E. Leon Kalahau Siu, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Hawaiian Kingdom. He is a prominent strategist, advocate, and spokesperson for Hawaii's independence. Minister Siu is a familiar participant in Geneva at the Human Rights Council and is working to restore or develop new relations between the Hawaiian Kingdom and other states. He is the chair of the Decolonization Alliance based in New York City, a co-author of the book Modus Vivendi, Situation of West Papua, and was nominated for the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. Minister Siu, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Oh, mahalo nui loa. Mahalo, aloha, yeah. Oi, everybody. I just am so pleased to be here. And thank you so much, Professor Nakamura and Monieka, for your presentations. Very, very, as was mentioned by the person who sent the comment in, very similar, of course, to our case here in Hawaii. And so I'm going to give just a very brief background, like Professor Nakamura did for Okinawa. So Hawaii, it was a sovereign independent country and recognized in 1843 as a sovereign state among European states. So first non-European country to be invited or to be part of the family of nations, which was, we can get into a long discussion over that, but which was the prevailing powers at the time over the world, basically the colonial powers. So Hawaii became part of, or became recognized by them as a sovereign country. So technically it was never colonized, that is, physically taken over until later. So 50 years after that, and Hawaii enjoyed, of course, a very prosperous time in between, but much of that prosperity had to do with sugar and sugar plantations. And that became part of our downfall, in that those that owned the sugar plantations began to get very greedy for more profits, or to secure their profits from their sugar, because the United States was their biggest trading partner. And so the sugar planters got into collusion with the United States military that was at that time coveting Pearl Harbor and the strategic position of the Hawaiian Islands in the middle of the Pacific. Because at that time, the United States had convinced itself that it was, it convinced itself about a doctrine of manifest destiny, that they were destined to spread their form of democracy, or whatever you would want to call it, out throughout the world. And the Pacific would be an ideal place to do so. And the Hawaiian Islands was the most ideal place to start this from. So the plot was in 1893 to seize the Hawaiian Islands for the United States to annex. And so the plot was from the insurgents here in Hawaii, again, the sugar planters and those that controlled commerce here in Hawaii. Plotted against the Queen, plotted a time to overthrow the Queen with the help of a military presence of the United States. Actually, it really was an invasion. And although Hawaiians did not resist the invasion, it was nevertheless an invasion by the US military forces. there has been a lot of controversy over whether or not Hawaii should have resisted the military invasion. But actually, our queen was very wise and actually trusted in the goodness of America and international law, thinking that America would abide by international law and denounce this rogue action by their minister, foreign minister who was stationed in Hawaii, as well as the military that was stationed here. But the U.S. turned out to be not quite as noble as the Queen thought that they were to be. So even though she filed a diplomatic protest, eventually those protests were ignored. And 5 years later, the United States acted to annex Hawaii. So in 1898, the United States annexed the Hawaiian Islands, although even that was a very questionable, actually a very illegal act, because there was no consent of the people or consent of the Hawaiian Kingdom to be annexed to the United States. But from that, the United States gained Hawaii as a military base and started to quickly build out Hawaii as a major military base, a naval base in particular for the United States Navy. The thing that gave them the excuse to do that was the Spanish-American War, which was going on in 1898. And then right after they defeated Spain, which didn't take too long, the Filipinos, who had been fighting for liberation from Spain, found out that the United States did not intend to actually liberate them, but intended to colonize the Philippines as well. So the United States basically said, no, we're now in charge, or we're now the owners of the Philippines. So the Philippine liberation activists and war fighters went to war against the United States, and a very, very large war ensued in which around 5,000 US military troops were killed, which is more than were killed recently in Afghanistan and in Iraq. But the Filipinos really took the pounding from this, and this is similar to Okinawa. In the Philippines, about 250,000 Filipinos died in that war. And so the war was very much one-sided and was very vicious. And to kill 250,000 people was not 250,000 combatants. There were 250,000 men, women, and children, innocent people that the United States basically committed genocide against. So as we're looking today at what's going on in Crimea, in Ukraine, this harkens back to the same thing that happened here in Hawaii. Although we did not have a fighting war in Hawaii, we suffered the same invasion and illegal action, unfortunately, no one at that time, none of the other countries with which we had treaties, protested the United States invasion of Hawaiian Islands. But because of that invasion, the United States was very much emboldened and took the Philippines, and was very much even more emboldened and decided to really plant their hooks into Hawaii and of course, like I said, annex the Hawaiian Islands. And the sole purpose, or the primary purpose of annexing the Hawaiian Islands, was to extend US military power into the Pacific. And that they successfully did, built up the Hawaii, and Hawaii is a major military fortress, and similar to Okinawa as well. I mean, there is so much military here in the islands, although much of it, it's not quite as obvious as it is in Okinawa, in Ryukyu. but but it's here nevertheless, and it's also the major command center for the Indo-Pacific Command of the United States, which covers not only the Pacific Islands, but the Indian Ocean as well. So it's not only the Pacific Ocean, but the Indian Ocean as well. So it is the largest military command in the world, and it's based right here. And as Moniaka talked about, the dangers that this puts us in is really quite astounding, because when you look at it, if any kind of real war broke out for the Pacific, the war would not be a war like you see going on in Russia and Ukraine, where there is, boots on the ground invasion, because there wouldn't be any boots on the ground here in Hawaii. Even World War II, when there were marine landings and the vicious fighting going on, this is not the type of warfare that it will be in store for the Pacific Islands in the future. It's going to be missiles, and it's going to be possibly nuclear missiles, because there's the only way to defeat the United States response to any kind of actions in the Pacific Rim area would be to wipe out the United States military forces here in Hawaii, which of course, like in the Philippines, happened in 1898 and 1902. It would mean wiping out the population as well, and the civilian population of Hawaii. So the entire civilian population and every living thing on the island of Oahu would be completely destroyed, annihilated. And so this is what we're facing. And this is why that we are so adamant about the fact that we not only need to demilitarize Hawaii, but we need to remove the United States from our islands, because their very presence puts us in mortal danger of attack from one of the US's enemies. So this is why we are stepping up our efforts to bring this to the attention of the United Nations, as well as the other the other nations of the world, specifically those who are islanders, to please assist us in removing the United States from our islands. Now, so this, I'm talking about these really catastrophic kinds of threats that are to our islands, particularly, in the event of a armed conflict. But there are other types of dangers that are presented to us in Hawaii, particularly just the simple presence of the United States military here in the islands puts us in grave danger as well. Not even if we discount attacks from America's enemies, we still are in grave danger with the military being here. And Emily is going to be speaking about that, and about what has actually occurred recently, as well as just historically, what kinds of dangers we face with the U.S. military presence here in the Hawaiian Islands.
Thank you, Minister Siu. That brings us to our next speaker, Emilia Kandagawa, a Hawaiian national of African Native American descent. For over a decade, they have been an officer and member of Huialoha Aina o Kale Maile Ali'i, a branch of the Hawaiian Patriotic League aimed at raising public consciousness around the political and legal history of the Hawaiian Kingdom under prolonged U.S. military occupation. They hold degrees in political science, anthropology, and land-based Indigenous education. Emilia, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Good evening and afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for inviting me. I personally, I don't know about those in the audience or those on the panel or those in the future who will be watching this recording, but I would like to take a breath after hearing these really difficult truths about our history and reality in the world and how similar they are and how unfortunate that is, to say the least. So I just want to take a breath and a moment to just recognize that there's a lot of grief that is going unexpressed as we try to just get these messages out there. So I'm going to take that moment to recognize that. And I also want to acknowledge the two really incredible Hawaiian activists and water protectors, Laulani Tio and Shelley Muyalka, who could not join us in person on this panel. They both are so brilliant in their love of truth and justice and the lahui, and I hope that what I share today in their place can be of value in that same spirit. And I think my comments are really more zoomed out in terms of posing questions about the context and the philosophical foundations, I think, of the movement for demilitarization and deoccupation, but even more broadly, all of the movements for justice in the world. These are all interconnected things, and so I'm even though I will be talking a little bit about Red Hill as our point of reference, I think there are other things that I want to kind of pose to the audience, and I think my comments are also more so geared toward those of us on the ground and maybe less so the people who are in institutions. But I hope that there's value in them. So Red Hill, as a point of reference for those who are not familiar with this issue, the United States Navy did build the Red Hill storage facility during World War II to store 200 million gallons of jet fuel, and it is 100 feet above the island of Oahu's largest aquifer. It is in the uplands from Pu'uloa, which is now referred to as Pearl Harbor. And the recent leak in November of last year that has gained media attention, and it's just one of several in the last 80 years since that facility was built, but that leak saw 350 times the so-called safe limit of jet fuel in the water. And so there are 9,000 families in the military who are still displaced. There are 93,000 homes on this island that have experienced contaminated water. And the military's own people have been in the hospital, but the Navy has continued to gaslight the entire community and has refused to shut that facility down. And 2 days ago, thanks to the organizing of a coalition of dozens of organizations, the Oahu Water Protectors and many others, 2 days ago on March 7th, the U.S. Department of Defense announced it would defuel and decommission the fuel tanks, but that pressure still needs to remain on them to actually follow through and to not simply relocate it to another island country. They do not have the history of good faith behavior, to say the very least, and they've known about these public health hazards for years, just like every other site of military violence and contamination in these islands and beyond, and they continue to actively deny these threats and evade accountability. And so all the more reason that we have to stay organized and vigilant at the grassroots level. In the most recent risk assessment report that they conducted in 2019, they confirmed 3 years ago now that within 5 years, there is an 80% chance of a major leak of 30,000 gallons or more. And so by 2029, that risk is 98% likely. And that inevitable leak, if those tanks remain where they are, with all that jet fuel, millions of gallons of jet fuel, there will be permanent damage to the water source for the vast majority of this island. That's 400,000 plus residents who depend on that aquifer for access to water, basic human right. Never mind the millions of visitors who are taken in by the tourism industry every year. And so generally speaking, as has already been illustrated by our other panelists, the massive negative impacts of military presence and expansion is well studied, well documented. We know that they are abysmal stewards of the land and the people. We know that the United States has been committing these war crimes in the Hawaiian Kingdom and elsewhere, well, in the Hawaiian Kingdom, specifically, since they helped overthrow the government and began the occupation 130 years ago now. So, we also know that the United States military fuels the sex trade industry that is trafficking and murdering cis and trans women and girls, that largely Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. We know also that it's not a mistake that there's a prison disproportionately incarcerating Black and brown people right next to those Red Hill fuel tanks that's poisoning the aquifer. And this happens to be also in a valley with a complex of sacred sites that were desecrated and severed from each other in order to make a road for the United States military's transport needs, put the needs in quotes. So, 2022, we don't actually need to prove that demilitarization is urgent and necessary. It's not more information that we need. It's the courage to understand and act on what we already know. And we need calls to action. We need a clear and sober assessment of our collective context. So those calls to action need to in particular affirm and meet the needs of the next generation. So people in my generation in particular, people in their 20s and 30s, and I feel like we're in our own kind of crisis because we have been coming of age in a culture where at a systems level, systemic level, we are often rendered effectively invisible, where we have had to become resourceful in the face of material, economic, political, emotional neglect, where our vision and our agency, our will, the possibilities that we can imagine for ourselves collectively are being undermined in every way possible. And the systems and institutions of power are not designed to be responsive to youth, nor to the multi-generational needs that are being highlighted by these crises of militarism, as a topic of our discussion today, among many others, of course. And so again, what can be the call to action, the specific calls to action, given how much we know already about what threatens us collectively and what we know about the obstacles to our shared movements for freedom, in the face of constant devastation and grief and apathy and status quo? How can we feel inspired to act and to engage in the kind of civil disobedience that this historic global moment is calling on us to do? And so that call to action, I would offer that call to action is ultimately ceremony and relationship, which are really the same thing. And in response to the crisis at Red Hill, as an example, the community gathered before dawn at the gates of the US Navy Command to hold ceremony for the building of Oko'a, the structure, to draw in all of what we need materially, spiritually, socially, politically, to fix what has been broken here. And reclaiming spaces in that way everywhere possible helps us make change from the inside out, and also helps us to bring joy to the grief that we're also moving through. And we build those same kinds of relationships in Makua Valley, which is another place that's impacted by US bombing and occupation on Oahu, where just by claiming space and by being in ceremony there over the years and inviting the military personnel to participate in that with us, we have observed the change in their relationship to us and the potential for solidarity ultimately with them in what will ultimately be the process of deoccupation. And that alone is, just one small example of something beautiful that comes from prioritizing ceremony and relationship building as the call to action. And the final thought that I want to share comes from this brilliant Black woman, musician, spiritual practitioner, Dana Lynn Knuckles. And this is about examining the deep context for how we even think about these complex, interwoven global issues. So the first point is that revolution begins in the body, and our body is water, period. Capitalism and the white supremacism and imperialism that it fuels indoctrinate us into numbing and dysregulating our relationship with our own bodies and our relationships to the bodies of those around us. And so poison in our water should immediately bring us all into radical awareness of exactly what needs to change. And the cult of whiteness, the cult of individualism, the cult of American exceptionalism demands that you sacrifice your firstborn if necessary for the cult to preserve itself, to preserve power over. And if you doubt the truth of this, you can ask the military, the US military mothers who are unknowingly bathing their newborn in jet fuel 4 months ago and was told by those military officers that there was nothing to worry about. So that's the first one. Revolution begins in the body. And the second that Dana offers is that liberation begins in the imagination. We have internalized these narratives and belief systems so deeply of white supremacism, of capitalism, of patriarchy, of American exceptionalism, the list goes on. We have internalized these narratives and belief systems so deeply that we often don't even recognize when our own thoughts and our own proposed solution, our own proposed calls to action to alleviate the suffering in our world, they still reinforce the existing abusive power dynamics. And so what is liberation? Liberation, Dana offers this definition that liberation is the act of communal imagining. It is the act of communal imagining. And so political liberation is imagining together the right uses of power. Economic liberation is imagining together what has value and how do we use it. Spiritual liberation, imagining together an understanding of why we exist and what all this life means. So we struggle to get there to this liberation through our collective imagining. We struggle to get there because we have so much trouble being able to rightly identify the source of our suffering. It's often hidden in plain sight. Even this crisis at Red Hill, our friend Kyle Kachihiro conducted a tour for Malama Makua, my t-shirt, as you can see, conducted a tour for us, a demilitarization tour, and he talked about how that concept of slow violence, the environmental violence, that when you pull up to Halava Prison, which is right on that same ridge where the fuel tanks are, it's hidden in plain sight. You wouldn't even know. These fuel tanks are on this, it seems like a very unremarkable ridge where it is, and yet all of this is going on. So it's hidden in plain sight. And our imaginations are colonized. We're unable to escape the coping strategy, the trauma responses that we've adopted to survive the worst that this world has given us, to the point where when we sit down and think about, we have conversations at the dinner table, we have conversations at the highest levels of government, when we sit down to think about what we want for our lives and our society, what we want it to look like, we imagine more forms of capitalism. We imagine more ways to accommodate and compromise for imperialism, for capitalism, and we just give it maybe a new vocabulary and a new story to justify it. But we have to understand the relationship between capitalism and imperialism and the militarism that it produces, and all of the misery that it reproduces in all of our countries. And we cannot make excuses for how demilitarization is not possible, it's unreasonable. We cannot make excuses to preserve this misuse of power. For 400 plus years, my father's indigenous African ancestors never thought they'd be free of chattel slavery. But look what happened anyway. It was as much about imagining something that hasn't been yet as it is about remembering what absolutely once was and can be renewed because it's time. The time has come. And so what I want to emphasize here is that we need to ask better questions to arrive at solutions and meaningful calls to action that don't just reproduce the conditions that we're trying to be free of. We need to ask questions like, how do we build trust? How do we become trustworthy? What does accountability look like? And how do we become more accountable? What does genuine security look like? And what kinds of human and more than human relationships give us access to genuine security? How do we find ways to prioritize those relationships when there's so many forces actively working to prevent us and undermine us from nurturing those connections that will give us genuine security? And so those are my thoughts. I'm just thinking more big picture here, and I hope that that folks can find some value in rethinking that. So thank you.
Thank you, Emily. That's a great message. A lot of moving and powerful things that you shared. Yeah, regarding the U.S. military's poisoning of Hawaii's water supply at Red Hill, very, very similar to the situation in Okinawa, where the U.S. military has an extensive history of poisoning Okinawa's water, including the tap water, the drinking water. This even just recently, just a few months ago, they did it again. There was another incident where the U.S. military deliberately poisoned Okinawa's drinking water with cancer-causing chemicals, and basically there's no one to hold them accountable. They can pretty much get away with whatever they want in Okinawa, and so we really want the UN, especially the Human Rights Council, to be paying attention to these things and to help hold the United States accountable for the poison, well, for all of their human rights violations, but especially something like the poisoning of drinking water, which should be a no-brainer. That should be obvious, an obvious basic human right, and yet in both Hawaii and Okinawa, and I'm not sure about the Mariana Islands as well, but the U.S. military has an extensive history of poisoning the water. So why are they continually allowed to get away with this? It's ridiculous. These are major human rights violations. Emily, you mentioned also about the young people, about how we need to raise up the younger generations more. We received a comment from Bianca Kinjo and Uchinanchu saying, we need to raise awareness of young people in Okinawa. I was surprised when I saw only old people in the manifestations. They are extremely depoliticized and manipulated by the Japanese government. Yes, these are good points. Certainly, we always need to continue to raise awareness and raise up the younger generations, right? I would like to point out, however, that part of the reason why the elderly in Okinawa are more visible in terms of voicing their support for Okinawan rights and opposing the U.S. military. Part of the reason why the elderly are more visible is because they're retired. And so younger folks, right? We have to go to work, we have to go to school during the day. We can't always be out on the grounds on the front lines. That includes myself, right? But I'm certainly there with the elderly peace demonstrators in spirit. I fully support them, and I try to find my own ways of helping boost their support and promote their voices, such as, on social media and things like that. And I know some other young Uchinanchu do the same as well. But at the same time, yes, it's still a great point. We absolutely need to continue to do what we can to raise up the younger generations. And finally, we received comments from a user in China on Weibo, Chinese social media, suggesting like, oh, we should include Native Americans in our group as well. And I just wanted to point out to the viewers that yes, absolutely, we do work with Native Americans, particularly Native Alaskans. And we will be doing another upcoming webinar next week, specifically about the issue of restoring Hawaii's independence and Alaska's independence. So we'll be featuring Hawaiians as well as Native Alaskan speakers in that. We will be sharing the information for that webinar soon on social media. So please stay tuned for that. Like I said, that will be coming up next week. Well, thank you so much to all of our speakers. I wanted to give you an opportunity to comment or respond to each other or to add any further thoughts you might have. Do any of the panelists have anything they would like to respond to or comments to add?
Yes, yes, I would like to. Emily, thank you so much for your comments, because I think you hit it right on the head about where we need to go, not just trying to politically solve things or do things in the same manner that had been done to us before, but really to do it in an entirely different spirit and with a different attitude. And this what you talked about, inclusion of the people who we would basically assume to be our adversaries, but we include them and we actually get into relationship with them, and we find that they will understand what's happening. The ironic thing about the Red Hill thing was that we've been complaining for years about the threat, but until the threat actually affected the people connected with the military, the families particularly, until they were affected, because the Pearl Harbor water system actually affected the housing areas for the military dependents. Until they were affected, really the military did not really pay attention to our complaints. But when they were affected, with their own people, so to speak, were affected, then it really became something that they had to attend to. And I tell you, those people were activists. I mean, they went to Washington, D.C. and just demanded, what we've been saying all this time, but coming from their own people. So what I think has happened is that in Hawaii we've made a shift where the general population of Hawaii is beginning to believe us and the things that we've been saying even more. And I think we've turned a corner on that. But I just wanted to end with one quote, and that is from what's his name? Biko, Stephen Biko, who was an activist in South Africa, anti-apartheid activist, but he was basically the guy who wrote a lot of things. And so Stephen Biko said, the most potent weapon of the oppressor is the minds of the oppressed. So because there had been such a long and protracted indoctrination of our people for generations, our what we had to get over is the oppressor's what the oppressors have put into our minds that cause us to be oppressed. So that's why many of our people still are having a hard time just processing a different way of thinking of things. And we still, a lot of our people still revert, like you mentioned, to the same old solutions or the same old processes of capitalism, imperialism, and things like that, because it's, in a way, that's all they know. But what's great about what's happening with us is that a lot of young people are now free of that kind of indoctrination that many of us older ones had gone through, and so you don't have as much of a battle to think in a different way and to think more like our ancestors thought about how to approach problems on a relational basis rather than on an adversarial basis. And so I just wanted to add those thoughts in because I think we're headed in the right direction. However, there is still a great urgency to move this along so that we take the Damocles sword that's been hanging over our heads and continues to hang over our heads, that if we can move things in such a way that we can lessen or rid ourselves of the threat of becoming engulfed in somebody else's war, then we will be a lot safer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Siu. Would any of the other panelists like to offer any further comments or closing remarks? I would just like to read the comment that Monieka wrote in the chat, just so we have it for posterity, so that people watching the recording later can see it, because the chat won't be visible. The Zoom chat anyway won't be visible afterwards. The YouTube chats will be visible. But Monieka wrote, just wanted to extend deep gratitude to the historical wisdom and solidarity shared. Grateful for the breadth and the ideas about where revolution and liberation seed from. Thank you, Monieka. Professor Nakamura or Emily, any closing thoughts?
Oh, you're muted.
Professor Nakamura, you're muted here. Professor Nakamura, you're on mute. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. By listening to the panelists, I had a new awareness, a new learning. So I've also found the common problems we are sharing. So I think it's very important to have this kind of panel seminar so that we are encouraged by each other and continue. I'm empowered by you to continue this independence activity in Okinawa. Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor.
And just so much gratitude and just mahalo to all of you. And Munyaka, she had to leave, so I cannot say it. just for posterity to her, but I'm grateful to participate and grateful to have heard all the stories that you folks have shared, and just feeling uplifted that this is really this is the beauty of what it is to share the burden of survival and to internalize that philosophy and put it into action in each of our movements, and to just never forget that, my freedom is your freedom is my freedom. So
thank you, Emily.
Very good.
Thank you again to all of our speakers today. Thank you for thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules. I know all of you have a lot going on, and you do a lot in your own hometowns and home nations. And so we are very, very grateful to each and every one of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to share your knowledge with us. Thank you so much to everyone for tuning in, everyone who tuned in for the live stream, as well as to everyone who will be watching later the recording afterwards. We appreciate you tuning in. Again, please come back next week for our next webinar regarding the specific cases for the restoration of Hawaii's independence, as well as the restoration of Alaska's independence, talking with Native Alaskans, as well as patriots of the Hawaiian Kingdom, and what the UN specifically can do in this case to help right these historical wrongs in the cases of both Hawaii and Alaska. And of course, it also has a residual impact for Okinawa and Guam and the Mariana Islands as well. So again, please check back next week for our upcoming webinar about that. Thank you so much to the Kiwani Foundation and the Peace for Okinawa Coalition again for sponsoring this event. And we will see you next time.
Aloha.
Aloha.